welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Okay. I really wanted to use this session to pick all of your brains on the state of independent cinema. But Vani, we will, of course, start with you, considering we've just seen your lovely film. It's a film that's sort of drenched in history, heritage, love, nostalgia. I wanted to get your perspective on the question you're sort of framing at the end of the film, which is there any hope for sort of single-screen culture at a time when cinema going itself is being threatened is a strong word, but is not what it used to be. So what is your sense, considering, as you say, so many of these theaters have closed down, but there is still that love. So is there any hope?
I don't know, sort of the toughest question to ask, right? I mean, which is why I left it as a question. So I think it's nostalgic for a reason that it doesn't exist anymore in the way that it used to. It's not essentially part of our lives in the way it was, right? That kind of film viewing and that kind of sort of mixing of people, and I think that's for me the biggest kind of loss that, that in public spaces, our spaces for public mingling have reduced so drastically, and cinema is a very, very good example of that. It was one of the places, so even if you look at eateries, you look at all the places that brought people together across class, across caste, across community, those are shrinking. And I think that and the polarization that's going around outside are very interrelated. And that's actually the kind of dynamics that come in towards the latter part of the film, where we see that what's happening outside happens inside, right? So I think there is a larger sort of crisis of who is an us and who is a them, right? And single screens in a way epitomize that. And honestly, definitely post-COVID, post-multiplex, post all of this, single screens are not the same. I'll give you an example. This film we've been wanting to show to so many people, and of course the perfect place to show it would have been at the Liberty. But as Errol at the Liberty said to me very practically, he said, I appreciate the sentiment, but it's 1,200 seats. And he said it will feel dismal if it's not fairly full. And I think that's one of the things that to fill that number of seats. And I remember Nazir talking about it a lot, in those days, saying that when there's very little audience, how do you still run the film? How do you bear the cost? How do you do all of that? And I think that these are the signs of the fact that it's going. But there's a bit of a mixed scenario. I wouldn't say it's all bleak, because post-2023, we are seeing re-releases of old films. We're seeing some interest in actually going back to see a film that may have been successful, like Andaz Apna Apna, which was just released, or stuff that was not very successful, but that is suddenly doing well. So I think it's a bit up in the air. I wouldn't say it's completely bleak, but I think that times have changed, and the options in the times when people like me were growing up for public entertainment were very, very few. Today I can sit here and watch a film simultaneously. If I'm bored with this one, I can watch something else. Put on my Bluetooth, it doesn't even trouble anybody. So the world is also changing. So,
but there is hope, which we will hold on to.
There is always some hope. So
I will take that. I wanted to take this opportunity to pick all of your brains on where the independent landscape is today. It feels like it's been last few years have been very exciting. It feels like indie cinema is having a bit of a moment in India. We see sort of, obviously, All We Imagine Is Light, While We Watched, All That Breathes. This year I think there was some 13 Indian films at Rotterdam. There was obviously Sabarbonda at Sundance, Berlin Shadowbox, and you are producer on both of those films. So I wanted to get a sense that with all the attention and accolades that are coming in, of late, it feels like, is that translating to the lives of independent filmmakers in India? Is that making anything easy in terms of the wider landscape, or are these sort of individual, isolated wins?
I think it's too early to tell. There's definitely, if you look at the genesis, the journey that all of these films have had, most, they've either come through funding that's European funding or soft funds from outside of the country, and those are processes that have taken maybe 6, 7, 8 years to put together, or it's been private equity that's come from a model that's outside of the studio system. So there's hope in that people are finding alternative ways to come together to make these things work. But right now there are few films, and they're few and far between. They're working in the sense that they're traveling and they're finding an audience outside of the country. But the amount of audience that they can find here is still an open question. I mean, I still think that there's hope, because I think I think one thing that's definitely changed is this idea of a wide release is something that's not possible, but it needs to be something that's much more controlled. You need to find your audience, and how you find your audience and how you reach your audience and how you change, especially COVID onward, a pattern of behavior where streamers have spent an incredible amount of money to try and convince people to stay at home, watch content at home, and then you have obviously all of this other kind of new emerging forms of content on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, to go back to the film, to films, and to watch films that are maybe, not masala films, or not sort of engaging in the typical sense of what a commercial film might be. I think that's still an open question, but yes, I do feel like there's definitely filmmakers who are finding new ways to do that. So there's hope in that, we can find new models of distribution for that. But how it works and what those models are is still an evolving conversation.
Neha, Svetlana, Tanuja, does it feel like indies are having a bit of a moment? Does it feel like there's more hope now than there was in recent years, or is the struggle constant?
First of all, I don't think indies are new. I think they've been around forever. And I also feel cinemas are not new. I love the part where the owner of Liberty spoke about how there were 45 different cinemas that his father had set up, and then he said, okay, I should consolidate and make one. Yeah. So you know what? It's going to evolve. It has to evolve, and that's just the nature of all businesses. I don't think we should panic. I don't think we should run. I think we should just feel good about how we're being entertained, and I feel as filmmakers give people the choice of what they can watch. The moment filmmakers start making films which have been commissioned as opposed to stories that they want to tell, I think that's where it gets broken. So it's not an us and them. We're audiences as well. So it is what we want to watch and what we're willing to make. It's really, for me, it's as simple as that. And as someone who's worked in marketing and distribution for the last several years, I mean, audiences can and will always humble you. They will surprise you, they will shock you, and they will terrorize you, always. But, I mean, you've got to tell a story, you should just do it. So I'm very hopeful.
Same question?
Yeah.
So who is panicking? It is the people who commission projects. If only I could get a penny for each time I hear, but how will we get the audiences in? I would be a rich person. Because it seems like there's absolute confusion there, and they are the ones who now we address with our creativity, as opposed to this time in the film, which by the way I remember very well, and I miss it, and I never thought I'll miss it. So where there was one person, my boss Mahesh Bhatt was the one person whom I had to say, boss, this is my story, what do you think? He'd say, okay, let's work on it. He is the only person that I had to speak to, and then he'd say, let's make it. Then his brother, the one who is the money guy in the team, would raise money from the market on interest, make the film absolutely on their own conviction and passion, and if it didn't do well, then they would compensate the distributor in the next film, where they would sell their film for less, So I do think that there was something that was beautiful, and indie film at this point, I mean, I think that it's just not considered, I mean, again, I've heard this so many times, viable enough, and unless there's a star in it, and so then you have to say, no, I'll make it in a really small budget, like a really small budget. So then, even then, but then what will happen about distribution? Who's going to come to the theaters? So film festivals is what one is depending on, which, by the way, I personally love. I think film festivals across the world are great. Where would you find a Spanish audience or a French audience, the locals watching your film, if it was just one of the mainstream films. So it's very difficult. It's not easy at all. A few get made. It's not like there's a trend, because people are always happy to suddenly pronounce there's a trend of independent film. There's a trend of, say, female-led films. When I started, there was no trend. It was just a handful, and every year it's been a handful. So
you have to just go for it, make your, like she said, that's what's really the defining feature of a film, whether it be in an indie film or a big film. Of what makes it special is because somebody loved that story and somebody just wanted to make it, and they made it no matter what. And they compromised along the way. I mean, I'm really experienced in the whole small budget filmmaking. You have to make it look like it's made for decent, good budget, but you have to somehow do all the stuff, like get people on, get your friends, get your A-lister friends and say, listen, this is the story, do you like it? They'll say, yeah, I like it, but I have only this much money. Okay, fine, let's make it. You know about all this. So, it's always going to be a battle for independent films.
But you mentioned that at one point in time you just had to convince one person, and now it's clearly that's not the case. I'm curious to know, for an independent film, a lot of the Indian indies tend to rely on international co-productions, grants, etc. Why is that? What is that challenge? Is it just finances here? Or just if it's not a mainstream film, we're not interested? Why is it always such an uphill battle, and why are they always looking outside? Why do they have to?
It was called an art film, which was a term that nobody liked, Oh, art film bana rahi hai, like that, So, but now the term is art house film, because yes, there are grants, wonderful grants across the world, and it's lovely to know that you will get money somehow. The applications are really long, and you have to really work hard at it. But there are grants across the world. In India, not so much. I don't know if you guys had trouble getting money here.
For the first question that you asked, I'm a bit more of a cynic. I don't think it's great for independent filmmakers out there. There are, of course, success stories, and very rightfully so, wonderful films that have come out, but the volume of independent filmmakers and the volume of amazing work that's happening, that's far bigger, and not all of them get a world stage, not all of them get world distribution. There's a filmmaker, Anmol Sidhu, he's made a lovely film called Jaggi. There's Achal Mishra doing his own thing, making films out of Darbhanga, him and his crew, almost like a collective. But it's like you said, like Naren said, a lot of private equity at play. And what you asked later, that's the big missing piece, state support. Why are there so many grants in Europe and US for documentaries or even for fiction features, and why do we not have that? That missing piece is what makes this unsustainable. So while we'll always have success stories, every year some films going to festivals and amazing films will continue to come out of here, but it won't ever be a sustainable thing until there is state support in terms of distribution, in terms of producing these films. I just want to jump in here on the question of documentary, because the scenario is quite different. It's not really a question of viability in the market, because that is sort of an oxymoron when you come to docus, right? So what you're actually looking at is multiple challenges, right? One depends on the kind, because there is a certain kind of documentary that is more acceptable in a global market on a country like India. It's very clear. But if you're making a certain other kind of documentary, if you're making political documentaries, if you're asking uncomfortable questions, and you're working under exigent circumstances, right? Those are not necessarily things that can wait. I was talking to Sulochana, I don't know whether she's here, but she's the filmmaker from Sri Lanka who had a film in the afternoon, and she said, where was the time? Things were just happening on the road, so I was shooting. And I was like, what about post-production? She said, you know what, I was in so much of a mess. And that's actually what's happening, because a lot of things, very rarely do you get, even this project, it took 10 years. And it took 10 years because the money came in. There were many, if you saw, many little grants. So we'd work a little and then we'd stop a lot. And then we'd work a little and we'd make do some other things to live our life and make money and get on and pay our bills and then come back. In some ways it worked for this film because it allowed us to really think, because where we started and where we ended up was where I wanted to end up, but it needed time to resolve that, because with cinema theaters there's so many stories you want to tell, and how do you sift it down to the question of the audiences and the experience, and how do you archive those as opposed to just archiving the buildings. But I'm saying that in most cases, and whatever little space there was within the state system of like in India, the public service broadcasting or whatever, where people like us did films which were problematic with this, to the state. nothing exists now. So, you're talking everybody trying to juggle some amount of commissioned work and then squeeze out a documentary on your own, and struggling with life balances. So, it's a very different set of challenges, not, with the same sort of broad market dynamics at play of what is acceptable and what is Indian enough and what is global enough and what is the language of the film. So there's much to be talked about and thought about there, but I think that it's become an extremely complicated terrain. And
which I think is a real pity, because in this country is bursting at the seams with stories.
Yeah.
You just won't never run out of stories in India, and it's the format that nobody wants to do. It's just,
unless you're doing murder and true crime.
Well, yeah, but horror in documentary, it's worth exploring actually.
Crime, horror.
But even murder and true crime, if of course it's going to a platform, there has to be a certain way you make it.
Yeah.
It cannot be. There has to be first episode needs to draw people in, and all, so you get sucked into that.
It has to be a sexy murder.
Yes, exactly, and your pace and stuff that is actually, I faced this in my last project where, just the longings of a woman who's been victimized in a marriage scam. We don't have time for that. It just has to be skipped over. Whereas I really wanted to keep, but it's slow. Audiences will not. So, a documentary feature has actually the freedom to express itself, I think All That Breathes was an outstanding, it was just a beautiful film, So I think that if that was on an OTT platform, it might have been a different film altogether. So it is the hegemony of, the platforms or like you said, that audiences are wonderful. I have nothing against audiences. They're amazing. And they may even say, "Theek thi, itni bhi achhi nahi thi," but they're not about ki shut it down, it sucks, it lost so much money, all this, aggressive kind of, the filmmaker is just butchered. So I do think that that audiences can like it. How do we know this? We don't know. We haven't tried enough.
Just to sort of add to that as well, is that even with features that you sort of asked about grants and why it goes through that process, is that if you really want to make a film unfettered, in the sense that you really want to make, if a director wants to make a film where they can stick to their vision and not sort of be guided by an imagined audience or a market that's coming through equity, because then there's this whole thing of having to recover the money. But if you go through a grant, and that's what we don't have here, which is the real failing. If you go through a grant, if it's the Cinéma du Monde in France or any of these European grants, they're not recoupable, which means that you don't need to return any of the money. And also what it means is that they incentivize local distribution, which means that if I get the French grant, it means that it's a French distributor is incentivized to sell the film in France, which means there's more chance of making money and the film recovering money that way. And that's not beholden to the kind of story it is. It just needs to be a film that's good. It needs to be, you need to get to, it has obviously this whole other world where you need to get to a certain kind of festival and you need to hit a whole bunch of other things and you need to hit the right kind of grant and all of that. There's another market sort of to play there as well. But it allows a lot more artistic freedom than if you were to go to a streamer or you were to go to private equity here. So that means that now the kind of private equity models that have to be put together are almost like patrons, where you have to find people who want to support the arts and see a value in it that's not necessarily only in the market. They see a value in either, pushing on their portfolio to other films, or just, they've made their money elsewhere with other projects, and they see this as something that they'd like to do on the side. But yeah, we need grants in this country. That's the big failing.
But Tanuja, you mentioned sort of the idea of packaging, and obviously that's in the context of streaming. I did want to ask, when it comes to mainstream films, there's a lot talked about in terms of how you're supposed to package it for saleability. And I was curious to know from all of you, is that sort of pressure ever there for independent films? There's a certain aesthetic a lot of them tend to have. There's a lot of talk of, for certain festivals, for sort of grants, etc., you have to hit certain themes and subjects. So is that ever a pressure that when you're trying to sort of set out on an independent film, it has to look and feel a certain way to tick the boxes of the market that you mentioned, Naren?
I think you need to hit right now art house drama is not doing well at all. It's not selling anywhere. It's very hard for those films to find distribution. So you have to get to a good festival. Now, I mean, there's people who will tell you that if you make a certain kind of film, you'll get into a certain kind of festival. But if it was that easy, everyone would be getting into all of those festivals. So
Depressing, basically, very depressing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that. I think you have to make a good film. Going back to what Neha was saying, I mean, I don't think it falls quite as easily as that you can make a film for a specific kind of market and it goes to a certain kind of festival. But you have to know how to write a grant, which is a different skill. But yeah.
I was just going to say that writing grants is also packaging, by the way. It's a complete, like if you ask a filmmaker to do two things other than make the film, one is to write the grant and the other to do marketing. Those are the two things they hate the most because it requires them not to be themselves at all. That audience is different. So, I mean, but in all seriousness, I do feel that given that it's so hard to make an independent film in India, that if after all of that you've secured distribution, if you are not authentic to that film and you try to sort of wing it, package it, or make it different from what it is, I don't think people will buy it. Yeah. But that's just been my experience. Like, if, for example, Payal Kapadia's film was presented by 3 soap opera queens and they were going to be promoting it, it would not be the story that would be promised to the audience. So it's just as simple as that. You have to tell them what's going to come. Yeah. You can't throw them off to the point that they expect something else, because then they'll reject you, and it'll be hard.
You can always feel the reverse engineered film. Vani, what about your world? You know, is there a, with documentaries, when the festival space is such a big part of the experience, is there ever sort of certain themes and ideas you feel in terms of the packaging, in terms of a kind of Indian film that is preferred, if that's the right way to put it?
There is. I think there is. It also depends on the festival. I mean, let's not be blanket about it, because there are festivals that understand issues, that are more grounded, or that are sections that are curated by people who understand a place. And it's not easy to understand the world, to be fair. But the thing is that there is also some stereotypes that play in, that you see repeated now in heavily fun, and it may not be everyone, so I'm talking about a trend, I'm not talking about specific films, but like in documentary, like for instance, this whole single character led, where you actually where the movement behind, let's say, a certain social change sort of dissolves because the character has to be pushed into the lead. There is a certain kind of push. And I remember once talking to a European curator, and he said, and he was critiquing a friend's film from Banaras. And she had done a fun take on what a crazy city Banaras is and how wild it is to find your way. And it was just a lovely but a fun film about the texture of being lost in Banaras. And his complaint was, it doesn't smell like Banaras. And I was like, I'm sorry, Banaras smells like shit, quite literally. So, that might be something that you want, because that's your notion of India, right? But we are here because I think that in and of itself, in India, the documentary movement, pretty much since I started in the last 20-30 years, has been actually in a fantastic space, because I think we're not just talking about a range of issues, we're talking about them in different ways, we're telling stories differently, we are not getting stuck in what is a documentary idiom. So, both in terms of form, in terms of content, in terms of what we want to explore, internal, external, there's a lot of very good stuff going on. So it seems to be at odds that somewhere there is also a sense that don't, in a way there's if I can put it in an old-fashioned way of saying, there is a colonial kind of eye which says that this is who you are, okay? And that sort of is something one sees every once in a while, and then one sees somebody who is able to take that funding but push it through. So I will come back to what you said earlier, that it's a lot to do with the individual and what you're able to negotiate. And possibly the level of conviction with which you can negotiate it. You might have the conviction in the project, but like you said, marketing a film, I used to always say I want someone to hack into my computer and find the projects that I really want to do, because I don't know how to go out and pitch them, right? So I think that's the thing, that you may be convinced about your project, but having the language, having the connection, having the mobility, having the class to actually go and navigate that space is a different ballgame.
But you have to partner. You have to partner with somebody who's good at that. Because I'm presently doing that, and they just know things that you would never know, in terms of even people who they've workshopped grant getting. You know, I was like, wow, tell me what to do, and I'll just follow.
You want to share the hacks? Like how does one get grants?
Yeah, no, I'm saying this
She's a
person,
partner with them.
Yeah, of course. She's producing consultant on my film. So I was like, you tell me how it's done and I'll do it. And so, you know, like for example, I'll give you an example. There's a director's statement. So I wrote like a very well written, good statement, but she said a very important thing. She said, this is not connecting with your life at all. So I said, why would they want to know about my life? They said, that is exactly what they want to know. So I start now my director's statement, something about me. I am, but how this, and they said this is what they want to read, which I wouldn't have guessed at all, you know. So I do think that we must partner with people who are skilled in these things, also marketing, of course, who will know, you know, what works, and then maybe you're left to your space of making it with a purity, you know, and doing it the way you want to. Also, there are no rules. We should break rules because, I mean, in Payal's first film, the documentary film, which is quite a stunning film, there's just loads of fiction in it.
Yeah.
So how
That's what
cool
I'm
is
saying.
that?
It is, in terms of form and content, there is a lot of very rich stuff going on. And I think that's what you do. I have to say that personally, you know, my relationship with this whole crisis is different because I do other things to make a living. And I'm not a prolific filmmaker. So I make films as and when I feel something that I feel really that I have to do this, and then I get into it, and then so I'm able to take some amount of hit and miss on. Often I'll just take a grant I get as seed money and just roll with it, and then say baki I'll just earn and do it. You know, so I have but it's a very privileged position. I recognize that there are people who just need to make their life. That's what they do. You know, so it's not possible for everyone to live two careers and two lives and two many things. So but systemically, it is very challenging. You know, and it's not even a thing of competition. It's a thing that the spaces for competition are also very few, that are somewhat more available to everybody.
And yes, finally it comes down to money because, you know, 3,000 films being sent to Cannes. How do you know they'll even watch your film? You have to have your agent there, and then you have to make sure that screenings are held. Screenings cost money. It all comes down to that.
No, but I did want to ask you about that. Let's assume that I've made my film as an independent filmmaker. I fought the uphill battle. I've got it. What advice would all of you have about navigating the global festival circuit in 2025? If I don't have a lot of experience in that area, I don't have access to fancy collaborators, how do I learn how to sort of use that space to really push my film as much as possible?
I think Naren would know more.
Do you want to give us Sundance hacks?
I think it's very important to have. It's important to budget for it. So, before you've made the film, you need to have set aside a budget for your publicist and your festival journey, because that publicist is what's going to really make or break that festival journey for you, which is getting into a festival. There you have to really roll the dice, because you have to hope that you can, I mean, if you don't have connections, you have to try and hustle and make them, which is that can even be a cold email and getting in touch with people, emailing sales agents, starting that process much earlier. But just knowing that I think often with independent films, because it's such a difficult process, one is just focused on finishing the film, you know, and just getting there. But that's just, that's just where it starts. You know, when you finish, you just have to start an entirely new journey, which has an entirely different process, where you need to be trying to get a sales agent before that, and you have to land a publicist before you get to a festival, because a publicist is a person who's going to try and speak to all the reviewers, and they're going to try and make sure that you watch the film. They have a list of people that they'll send screeners to, and because when you get there, those initial reviews in that first week or that second week of the festival is what really decides the entire journey of the film from then onward. And getting a sales agent is also really tough, and so it's these things where you have to really mobilize early on, and then it's just rolling the dice, but you have to try and do as much of that as possible and budget for it.
Start early and budget. I think we can talk about the streaming elephant in the room now. Svetlana, we will start with you. Obviously, you are a niche platform. You don't come. You're not one of the bad guys. But
No, we love these guys. I love them.
So I'm just curious to know what your learning has been in terms of sort of fighting the fight of independent cinema, and sort of finding that audience for the kind of films that you guys champion. Like, is there a big audience for it?
There is a big audience for it. The kind of reception we see for films, not even films like I mentioned Jaggi or Achal's films, which haven't necessarily traveled to international festivals.
All of which are on MUBI.
Yeah. Which there is a huge audience. The kind of response that we receive in terms of, not just in terms of numbers of who's watching them, but also in terms of the conversation around them on social or in press, it's really incredible. And something that we did anticipate, like we do see, MUBI has a very defined idea of who our audience is and who are potential audiences, and these films do reach all of that, and that's, so there is an audience, and I don't know if they would release in the cinema, if these films were to release in cinema, if this audience would go there also, but they do come to the platform to see them.
And how does, I mean, if there's an independent filmmaker wanting to go down the MUBI route, how do they get in touch? Is there do you just get pitched to all the time? Is there a process?
So ideally, we solicit films. It's a very small team, and it's a very curated platform, so the number of programming slots that we have in a year are very limited. So while we do get pitched to all the time, our preferred way of working is that where we reach out to filmmakers and where we reach out to producers and ask for their films.
But talking about the other guys, the other players, when streaming came in, a lot of people thought it was the solution. This is a place where every different kind of film and narrative could coexist, and that seemed to be the case until a point, and now it feels like that party's over. So what is the right way to think about these big players? On the one hand, do they have a responsibility to fight for the little guy, or is it as simple as they're obviously just going to go where the biggest audience is? How does the independent landscape look at streamers? Because on the one hand, you want them to sort of pitch in. At the same time, obviously, they're just going to go with the business decisions.
One thing I want to add there, like, we are talking about streamers, whether it's MUBI or any other streamer, they're not the bad guys. The thing is, again, it's a problem with our system. We do not have art house cinema chains. We do not have a system that's so filmmakers also look at platforms as the whole and soul recoupment of money for themselves, which is not necessarily the case outside of India, where there are other modes of recouping whatever they have invested into the film, and streaming is just sort of the last leg of the journey in that sense. And we lack that system where these films could have an independent run before coming to the platform, which would also contribute to the revenue they make. And yeah, no.
But it's also, right now, it feels like an appetite problem, right? It feels like if you're a major streaming platform, there is no appetite for independent films. So, is that a problem, or is it sort of unsurprising, and it's, the landscape just has to figure it out and find alternative distribution?
I don't want to try and attempt to answer that, but here's the thing. You cannot hold the streamer accountable for not wanting to take your film. I don't think that's cool. Not because it's not on them and there should have been balance. They are not going to come and give you one memorandum 2 years ahead of time saying, by the way, 2 years from now, I may not want your project, right? So I think to what Naren said, and I completely subscribe to that, and I worked at a studio for several years. The most important part of what a studio did, which I think independent filmmakers are doing increasingly now, is to sit down on a finance plan. Is to sit down and say, this is what it's going to cost me for the 0 to 10 journey to make the movie, and that the 10 to 100, which is to take it to the audience, is also going to cost me, and budget it. And say, okay, what are the films in this zone, and what have they made? So for example, if a particular film has cost X amount of money, and it's fairly easily available, this information in terms of how it's recovered, what it's recovered, and if it's not recovered that money, I think that's a good telling sign of, okay, maybe this is not how to budget it. I feel the other piece as a producer, which is really important other than chasing and being passionate about storytelling, is to also be really accountable to how much you're going to spend in making that movie. And therefore, to the money that you're only investing, whether it is private equity, whether it is soft financed, I think it's going to set a benchmark for the next one that might cost the same, right? And I don't think independent filmmakers do that enough, or as rigorously as maybe studios do, because they are employees of a system which will fire them if it doesn't make the money. So imagine, you have to be able to fire yourself.
So there is something to borrow that mentality and that approach for independent.
Perhaps, yes.
I mean, it's not entirely doom and gloom. All We Imagine and Girls Will Be Girls sold to streamers, and they sold to streamers for good amounts of money, where they recover their money and some. Exactly. So it's not impossible. And now the government is now buying films as well through waves. I don't know what the numbers are, but they're not small either. So I mean, there is hope, but I think it comes back to that same thing, which is that you have to really plan out. I mean, it's very hard because the journey changes when you're making a film. When you start making and when you start budgeting a film to when it's done, the entire streaming landscape has changed maybe 10 times. But budgeting for that step, which is that publicity, the right awards, hopefully run that you can try and push for at festivals or whatever it is, you need to build that appetite with the streamers. And that comes through the kind of publicity that you're doing and the kind of way that you build, a perception of the film as well. So, I mean, something like that happened obviously with All We Imagine 1, Girls Will Be Girls 1, and if you do manage to hit all of those steps, All That Breathes as well, sold to HBO. So if you manage all of these things, then it is possible, but it's hard, it's very difficult. So you have
just
to
get
have
Oscar nominated and you're sorted.
Or win at Sundance, or win at Cannes, yeah.
Why not?
And why not? And then you win. But
No, but I just feel like just ask yourself the hard question of who's my audience? Who am I making this film for? Where are they sitting? Are they in India or somewhere else in the world? And what are they watching? I feel like if you just ask yourself these 4 or 5 questions, some of it will become clear at that point.
Let me propose something the opposite of that, which is that, first of all, the studio budgets are exactly what went wrong. The studio budgets were the huge budgets. Small movies don't really lose money. It's the big movies that lose money, and studio budgets made enormous budgets. And they were paying, of course, big stars, enormous money. So that, and then they suddenly realized how much, including the OTT platforms, realized how much in deficit they were, how much they had actually lost, which meant then suddenly shelving projects and suddenly cutting down on budgets. So I do think that in fact, an independent film, if I'm making a really small film, I don't know if I want to ask who's going to watch it. I'm just going to say, let me get the best team together. Let me beg Naren that do my music in Little Money Man, and let me do all that. Let me get everybody together, make a movie in small films. We'll see who watches it, It'll find someone if your story is told with this kind of feeling of that I really want to make it, and so therefore I'm getting my friends to. I mean, I did make a really tiny, it was really, really, really tiny documentary, which of course one of the great things was it was on MUBI, and so I feel very proud about that. And the bigger platforms don't want it, which is fine, whatever. But maybe over the years, maybe over 5 years, 10 years, it'll find audiences. And that has happened with all my films actually, even the mainstream ones, and even with say Kareeb Kareeb Single, which opened to a modest collection when it released. And over the years has just become something else, So I think that these re-releases, by the way, are a good thing.
Actually, I want to comment on this because on the question of, there's always not always, but often there's a loss and gain story. I remember at the first screening of this film, Shonali Bose was there. And she made a point. She said, while I understand the question of the single screen and the heterogeneity and everything that's gone, the multiplex allows filmmakers like me to release a film in the public domain because they have smaller screens, 100 people, 150 people. So it can bear a week of the theatre owner actually, the theatre chain or whatever, just risking it, because they're able to block it into a smaller theatre. So therefore some other spaces open up. So I think there's multiple things to think about. And of course she's talking about her fiction work, but still saying that, which big single screen would take a risk on it, right? But a small multiplex will run it, and then of course also then there are also certain kinds of awards, etc., which you only qualify with for if it's already been in a theatre and so on and so forth. So certain other doors open up. So not something I know about, but I mean it's just experientially you realize that there is those. Because a smaller film might speak to a larger audience or might speak to a niche audience, so that's also something in there.
I do have a few more questions, but if anyone has questions in the audience, just raise your hand. We'll get you a mic in a second. Sorry, Naren, were you going to say?
I just wanted to add one thing to what Tanuja had said, which is I slightly disagree. I feel like it's an onus on a producer, especially for an independent film, to find the audience after it's made. Because I do believe those audiences are there, but there's a huge it's almost like canvassing. You have to find each film has, like there was a film called Rapture, where the director had taken the film back to the Northeast and traveled with the film, and because they did their own guerrilla way of setting up cinema halls and setting up screenings, they had packed houses for weeks, and they made a significant amount of money. But that came from them finding their audience and finding a unique solution to get to their audience. And I think those audiences exist, they're there, but the system is broken. We don't have art house theaters here. Streamers will not take a punt. So you have to find a way to build that. You have to find a way to canvas. You have to find a way to get to that. And it requires creativity, because every film will have a different audience and therefore a very different kind of solution.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, by the way. I was talking about thinking about the audience before making the film. After making the film, absolutely, you have to try out all alternative systems. Must. And there are some. I know in New York, I have a producer friend. He made a film called Israelism, which has done really, really well. It was all alternative ways of distribution, and exhibiting. So that one must do, yes.
I think there were.
Maybe there's some lessons to learn from documentary filmmakers who all live in the alternate space and keep looking for more alternate spaces to function in.
Sorry, was there a question in the audience?
Well,
No?
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I was earlier. Somebody talked about we wish there was state funding, and we know the state that we live in right now, and we know what they do fund.
Of course.
I mean, there's Kashmir Files, there's Kerala Story, there's a whole lot of films that are funded. We fund through the government, but that government is not going to fund the kind of films we make.
Yeah.
We know that. So what are we talking about when we look for state funding in today's India? If I would have said this about 20 years ago, I would have argued for it.
Yeah.
We argued for films division to continue, for the festivals to be run in the way they were being run in those days, and we complained about it, but we know now it's completely different.
And didn't Shyam Babu make so many films from funds like that? NFDC, exactly. And these, how lovely.
Yeah, but now it's it's also interesting that we're talking at this point. I think 1st to 4th, they're launching. I mean, it's being called an audio visual something exhibition, but basically it's an OTT platform being started by the government, which is called Waves, which they're launching here. So and they're going to teach the world how to do content. So we know exactly where they're going. But I think there's a question at the back.
Yeah, so can we get a mic there, please?
Yes.
So I know that right now, like a lot of remakes of films are really popular, whether independent or not, both here and also in Hollywood. And I was wondering, if there was sort of a remake of something, how would you pitch it without saying it's a remake? And then my second question is, with AI and that really becoming a big process or an element in production, how can you use that better rather than relying on it?
Sorry, could I just clarify your first question? You said, how do you pitch a remake without saying it's a remake?
Yes.
Okay.
You shouldn't. Because you have to get the rights. What?
I think he said it's called plagiarism.
Also, can I just answer the AI question? Just don't use it. Thank you.
No, so I guess my advice would be to write it openly and properly and write it like a remake. And if it's remade from something which was a very popular film, that might even be something good too, because if you pitch that, the producer might get excited,
That I jump in with the AI. I'm not such a anti-AI person. As someone who's entering producing for the first time and trying to understand distribution, writing grant applications, it was a very useful research tool. It was a great way to say, okay, who distributes? It was often wrong, but it was a start. It was who are the top Portuguese distribution companies? and it would give me results much faster. At least point me to places that I could start looking for results faster than a Google search. So, if for research, for grants, for just to understand market landscape, for production, it can be, if it's something that you're starting out for the first time, it can be a helpful first step that can lead you to better and more informed searches in the second step. So it can help maybe in that thing.
Can it help write, sincere question, can it help write grant proposals? Like
very bad ones, but you can put your grant proposals in, and it's a good sounding board.
You can just tweak it.
Not tweak it. You have to rewrite the whole thing, hopefully. But you at least you have a place. Sometimes that blank page, can be very daunting, especially if it's the first time you're doing something. So it can help that way. If you can just put random thoughts in, it gives you some structure, and then of course you have to write it yourself and do something of your own. But it's helpful, especially when you're starting.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, there's one at the back.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm not in this filmmaking space. I'm more of a product designer. So I just wanted to understand from you guys, like, what is the life cycle of a filmmaking journey, like, as of such, and if you want to put in a percentage number on the amount of creativity you put in the film compared to, let's say, you have to do lots of other things like as you mentioned, marketing, distribution, film festivals and that sort of thing. So in your terms, like, how much is the creative side of things, which is your filmmaking side of things, and what all other energies you end up spending?
How much is hustling? How much is creativity?
Hustling is creativity. Yeah. It's all creative.
Sometimes creativity is sheer hustling. I don't have an answer to that. I'm terrible at both the pre and the post, the pre build up and the grant getting and the marketing. So I have nothing to contribute to this discussion. I wait for magic to happen, and at some point I decide, अच्छा, the film has traveled enough. Now it will do its own work. अब मेरा काम खत्म हो गया, उसका काम है. It must speak for itself. It must stand on its own legs, and it should move. So I don't know. I mean, I think everyone else here is better equipped to answer that. Though I think you did. You sort of gave it a 10% or 0 to 10 and a 10 to 100. So, yeah.
Hello. Oh, I must say that when my first film showed at New Excelsior and Chavan Center and NCPA and 30 festivals, that was in 1975 till about 1990. It was showing to like full houses, full festival audiences, and the scene has really changed, as you all put it. I mean, from one theater, one big screen, it's changed completely. But for the independent filmmaker, the multiplex is very good, I think. I mean, because as she was saying, that smaller audiences, so it can be a full house. So I think we need more art house theaters, and people can build them now. I mean, it's a different scenario. So I think that can happen. And now my films are getting invitations from 30 festivals, the 2 recent films I've made. So the festival scene is buzzing. I mean, you all have to look for them. There are millions and millions of festivals everywhere in the world. And I'm getting invitations. Every day I go and I open my computer and there's another invitation there. And I don't have money to pay the fee, so they give me 50% discount. I got 70% discount from some Calcutta Film Festival. So they may be small, but the audience is growing. My audience is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, I'm happy to say. So I just want to encourage everyone that it's not such a bad scene if you I mean, I agree with the creativity part, how much time goes in that, how much time goes in technology, how much time goes in hustling, how much, I agree with that's a pain, but I'm quite happy now because my films are getting off the ground finally, So this is a very good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for the optimism. If there are no more, we've got one more.
I just want to add that if you have a reasonable festival journey, screening fees can actually amount to quite a bit. So it's a pretty, it can be a source of revenue, pretty reasonable source of revenue.
The first 2 or 3 I said, when you word of mouth, now they're inviting me and now getting 30, 40, 50% discount.
But I think you were talking about charging to be screened. Yeah, he's talking about charging money when they screen your film so that you can earn from it.
Oh, I don't know about that. I haven't come to that yet.
With filmmakers being the soft targets of somebody or the other getting offended in India, is it becoming more risky, and probably you'll have to show it first to a lawyer before you screen your films?
I'm guessing with independent films, the challenge is to get an audience in the first place. So that's a secondary problem. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You know, I must share. You suddenly reminded me of this is 1997. I remember my boss Mahesh Bhatt. You know, he got me into the habit. I used to actually call all the theatres myself when my film released and speak to the manager कि आज का collection कैसा था, response कैसा था. So he would tell me. So he was calling me. He says, तो क्या public response कैसा है? Not for my film, by the way, another one. Public response कैसा? He said, तो वो पंजाब में था. He said, public आती तो response बता देना, public की. Oh God, he was so bizarre, and you know, I loved those guys. I loved the old big theatre, you know, managers. They were fantastic. You know, I loved them. Just remember that.
I'm guessing that's the best answer to that question. I will conclude and ask all of you, what is one thing that gives you hope when it comes to the Indian independent film landscape? What gives you hope? Depressing.
No, actually, I think it's just the people. I mean, I just constantly today, there are so many people who are filmmakers. Yeah, many of us are not schooled in film, but many of us are just committed to issues, to questions we want to raise, to things we want to do, and the fact that everyone is innovating, are thinking on their feet, or having to think on their feet. I think it's people. For me, that's it. I mean, every time I get like, oh my God, now how am I going to do this? Like I'm thinking about something I want to make, and I can see it down the road, of course, because that's how I make films, very, very slowly. But I'm like, okay, how will I figure this out? I'm like, it's a little way down the road, but then I'm meeting other people who are telling me how they survived it, how they made it. I look back, it's okay. You know, that enterprise is what for me is where the heart of it is.
In the people. Naren?
In some ways, this was to answer the earlier question about what kind of state funding and the government. I see hope in that there I don't know if it's too early to tell, but I mean, like with Shadowbox, for example, we found a slightly different model where we could raise private equity through a larger number of co-producers coming on board. But it seems like there are options, and including, you know, people like the Premji Foundation and other private equity, you know, other sources of funding that are outside of the studio system coming in. It's looking like there is an appetite for that, and there is an appetite to set up or to try and disrupt or change how this model works, both in terms of like possible venues for films and also in terms of how films can get funded and get made, and especially
this is also for independent
films and possible grants that could be set up in the course of the next few years, which are outside of the state but outside of the market and the studio system, but coming from private equity, but operating in that vacuum that the state has left.
But
you know,
someone who gives a shit.
Yeah, there are people. Then there are people with large amounts of money who do, and it's not like this country is not making vast amounts of money in other sectors. You know, and now CSR is, you can put CSR into film. So there's hope there, I feel like, for alternative ways of funding and alternative ways of distribution. So hopefully, and there are audiences, and you know, there are films, and there are lots of filmmakers and people making amazing stories. So hopefully there's a way to connect all of those things together, and there are people who want to. So let's see if it can happen. Yeah.
First, adding to state funding like he did, of course, when one imagines state funding, one is not imagining it with just the same government in power forever. One is imagining a more egalitarian landscape, and also state funding not just for producing, but also probably in terms of distribution, theatres, support to single screen, multiplex, or some kind of, you know, support for theatrical exhibition of films, which is also a key part of the journey. gives me hope for independent films is that it's a very egalitarian space in terms of making films. There are so many stories to tell, and there are filmmakers in remote corners because of internet, because of YouTube, social media. They have access to information and knowledge on how to do it, and they're going out there and doing it on their own with just one camera or just their phone.
Yeah. And it does feel like a space where the next great filmmaker can come from anywhere.
Probably,
which
yes.
doesn't necessarily feel the case with mainstream cinema. Neha?
Totally, I completely agree with what Svetlana has said, but also I think there's a lot of egalitarian audiences. People can watch anything, anywhere, literally. And that's quite cool and hopeful because as a filmmaker, I don't have to fight distribution as much as I did have to. To ma'am's point earlier, being in a single screen of 1,200 people, I mean, it's not that overwhelming anymore. And anyone can be a filmmaker. I mean, a lot of us in this room are sort of self-taught in that sense, in this room as well. And I do feel that anyone can be an audience, and we made it very easy for them now. So I'm excited.
So my hope is more personal, which is that the love for storytelling, it just hasn't dimmed in any way. I've been around now almost 30 years at the crease. So I do think that, the love for it, and then I loved your film so much. It was so nice. So, there's a person who makes a film, and I wouldn't have known of it had Ketki not called me, and I was so happy to watch it, brought tears to my eyes. And so I do think that, just the love of it will have results, will be fruitful, and down the line people will watch. Your films will outlive all of us. They're going to be there long after we're gone. So some point somebody will watch it.
Sorry, just to add a small anecdote. We were in a room of people, and someone had come in and talked about YouTube and gaming and saying, oh, it's doom and gloom, and there's always these new things that are doom and gloom, and it means what's going to happen to film, what's going to happen to independent film. And there was a friend in that room who said, listen, I work in theatre. So like mediums last, like so.
And just to sort of complete that thought, it's like I have all my films, with the exception of this one, are online. Okay, free access, online, whatever. And when you make a film, for instance, the one before this was on the question of the death penalty. There is a limit to how many audiences you can actually physically take it out to. So there's also these possibilities of, but once you have it up on, let's say, even a YouTube and a Vimeo, and you just keep it open access, it is amazing how many people will see it. Yeah. On their own, without invitation, without an event, without anything. Because people are also scoring to look for interesting stuff, right? So I also feel that, at Tanuja's point of how things live beyond you, they also live beyond you when you move on to your next thing. And that is also something that, so audiences are also, makers are also growing. And audiences are also doing their own thing in terms of how to find stuff and how to then inform themselves, in different ways. So, what's not to be hopeful about at the end of it?
Well, I will absolutely take that optimism. But thank you, all of you. Thank you for the hope. Thank you for the perspective. Thank you for the stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.